During 2022, most of the world's eyes were firmly fixed on the catastrophic events taking place in Ukraine and Russia. But over on the other side of Eurasia, 2022 was a very busy year for North Korea as well. Kimjongun's regime spent it by firing more missiles than in any single previous year. At least 90 of them, 8 of which were classified as intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Among these 8 ICBM tests was the record-breaking one accomplished on the 24th of March, when the North fired an ICBM from near Pyongyang that soared over 6,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Across approximately 71 minutes of flight time, the missile arced down and crashed into the Sea of Japan just to the southwest of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. This test achieved the highest altitude of a missile ever fired by the North Koreans to date, while analysis of the missile's trajectory and flight time suggests a disturbing new reality. It is likely that whatever missile the North Koreans fired here possesses the capability to strike targets at a range of around 15,000 kilometers. Which is frightening because it now places nearly the entire world outside of South America within North Korean ICBM range, which of course includes the entirety of the US mainland. But this test wasn't even the only record-breaking missile launch the North achieved in 2022. Several months later in October, they would also break their missile record for distance. On the 4th of October, the North Koreans fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile from around here in the north that flew clear across the Sea of Japan and over the airspace above northern Honshu before crashing far to the east in the Pacific Ocean, around 4,600 kilometers away. That test all but confirmed the North's current ability to fire ballistic missiles that can strike targets anywhere in South Korea, Japan, or US military bases in Guam that are home to nearly 22,000 US troops. And now, with nearly 100 missiles fired over the past year, the North is likely getting ready to carry out its 7th nuclear weapons test. The last time the North detonated a nuclear bomb like this was in 2017. The explosion that one generated was already estimated to be around 50 kilotons, or about twice the power of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima by the United States in 1945. It's unclear how powerful their next test will be, but what is clear is that North Korea's ability to deliver nuclear warheads on the tips of missiles is advancing rapidly. And it's not just their development of strategic nuclear weapons that can theoretically deliver city-ending bombs to anywhere in the United States. The next objective on the North Korean weapons checklist are tactical nuclear weapons. And once they acquire those, stopping the Kim regime will become an almost impossibly high cost for anyone to bear. You see, tactical nuclear weapons differ significantly from strategic nuclear weapons in a few critical ways. Tactical nukes are dramatically smaller in scale and shorter in range, and are only intended to be used to accomplish limited military objectives on the battlefield. They can be fired as if they were artillery, and their authorization to be deployed can be placed into the hands of battlefield commanders. This contrasts with strategic nuclear weapons, which are the big, frightening ICBMs that can travel between continents and annihilate entire cities, whose use is often regarded only as a last resort and where the authorization to fire is entirely placed within the hands of the head of state. In the case of North Korea, they already have strategic nuclear weapons, but these are largely useless for deterrence all on their own. In the case of an all-out war between North Korea and South Korea along with the United States, the North knows that it is 100% guaranteed to lose a conventional conflict. The United States has nearly 30,000 troops deployed to South Korea already, around 50,000 more ready nearby in Japan, and 22,000 more relatively nearby in Guam, while the United States Pacific Fleet, headquartered over in Hawaii, is the largest of all of America's fleets, with 250,000 sailors and Marines, 2,000 aircraft, and 200 ships under its command ready to be deployed. In the event of war, the United States and South Korea's significantly better technology all but guarantees that they would quickly overpower the North's primitive air defenses and achieve complete air superiority, enabling them to pummel the North's defenses and troops on the ground with near impunity. One only has to look at how rapidly the United States overran Iraq in 2003 as a prime example. In only a little more than 5 weeks, the United States' overwhelming air superiority and accompanying ground invasion enabled them to topple Saddam Hussein's regime and inflict tens of thousands of fatalities on his technologically inferior army, while only suffering less than 200 deaths of their own in the process. So, just like Iraq, Kim knows that in a limited shooting war with the United States without ever resorting to nukes, his regime will probably get wiped out in a matter of weeks. But strategic weapons on their own still do very little to balance out this calculus. Were Kim to perceive an attack coming from the United States, firing one of his strategic nukes across the Pacific to hit an American city somewhere would be guaranteed to incur a retaliatory strategic nuclear strike from the United States, which would also result in the complete annihilation of his regime. Under either scenario, North Korea is 100% guaranteed to lose a conflict with the United States in a limited conventional war or in a strategic nuclear war. But tactical nuclear weapons give the Kim regime a fleeting glimpse at hope that they could still somehow win. Under a scenario where they've got tactical nukes and the Kim regime, for whatever reason, perceives an imminent invasion or attack coming from the United States and/or South Korea, tactical nuclear weapons loaded onto short-range ballistic missiles could be fired in a first strike policy in order to wipe out major American Army, naval, and air bases across South Korea in order to neutralize the immediate conventional threat on the peninsula before they could be used to disarm the North. Additional tactical nukes could then be fired at any approaching American carrier strike groups in order to prevent additional US naval and air assets from making a conventional counterattack. Simultaneously, North Korea would keep all of their longer-range strategic nuclear weapons in reserve and on standby in order to, hopefully, from their perspective, deter the United States from retaliating with their own strategic nuclear strikes. Were the US to do so, the North could, conceivably, fire their strategic nukes in reserve and hit a major American city somewhere. And while it's not exactly clear if the North Korean ICBMs could actually make it across the Pacific on their own or break through American missile defenses, the possibility for them doing it isn't zero. And that would give the US pause on whether to respond with a nuclear option or not. The ultimate point of North Korea acquiring tactical nuclear weapons, though, isn't to necessarily use them, but to simply continue deterring the United States from ever attempting to attack them. The point is to simply make it clear that any attempt to disarm the North of its nukes or remove Kim from power would be far too costly and bloody a decision to make. And this makes North Korea one of the most difficult countries in the world for the United States to deal with. By this point, the North likely has around 50 nuclear warheads in its arsenal and missile launch sites across the country. Were the United States to ever lead an attack into the country with attempts to quickly locate and eliminate all of the North's nukes before they could be deployed, there's always just the possibility that they would miss one or two that could then be launched at South Korea, Japan, or even the US mainland. An event that could possibly result in hundreds of thousands to even millions of civilian casualties. And even if it wasn't for all the nukes, the North still possesses a formidable conventional deterrent to an invasion as well. Over the past 70 years now since the ceasefire ended the outright fighting in the Korean War, the North has spent it digging in thousands of artillery pieces all along the border that are all trained on the South Korean capital, Seoul. Seoul is only located around 50 kilometers away from the North Korean border and is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, while the metropolitan area around it is home to nearly half of South Korea's entire population, some 26 million people. All of these people live well within range of the North's thousands of artillery pieces just across the border, which effectively means that whether it feels like it or not, Seoul is being held as a hostage at gunpoint by the North. In the event of an all-out war continuing in Korea, North Korea's artillery could deliver tens of thousands of shells directly into Seoul within a few minutes' notice, resulting in apocalyptic levels of destruction. South Korea even conducted a simulation on this exact scenario back in 2004 that assessed within only the first 24 hours of a full-scale conflict with the North breaking out again, there would be up to 2 million casualties suffered, mostly inflicted from the North's withering artillery fire into Seoul. And that was all before the North had nuclear weapons and before the ground war would begin. This ultimately all just means that there isn't any possible way to militarily confront North Korea that doesn't end up with millions of casualties somewhere. So, what about alternative ways to try and stop them? There's punitive economic sanctions, but these are very difficult to actually use to stop North Korea for a couple major reasons. First, North Korea is already so severely sanctioned that it's already largely isolated from the global system of trade, so additional sanctions do little to make their situation any worse than it already is. And secondly, completely isolating North Korea from the entire outside world is difficult because of China. China continues to trade extensively with North Korea and enables them to bypass many of their international sanctions. In 2020, more than 88% of all North Korea's international trade was conducted exclusively with China, largely made up of coal and mineral exports the North sells to China. Now, the Chinese trade extensively with North Korea for a multitude of reasons, but one of the largest reasons is that, at least on paper, the North Koreans and Chinese are official allies. Both countries continue to actively maintain a military defense treaty that would call the other into a war if either were attacked by an outsider. And the reason why, from the Chinese perspective, is pretty clear enough. Try for just a moment to view the geopolitical board of East Asia from Beijing's perspective. Their immediate access to the greater Pacific Ocean is hemmed in by a string of nearby islands that are all closely allied to the United States. The Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, which effectively functions as an island state because of their sealed-off border in the north. To the south, India is a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia, while Vietnam is considered another major potential ally of the United States due to their heavily conflicting maritime disputes with the Chinese in the South China Sea. China is at risk of becoming nearly encircled by states who are friendly to Washington, with the only very notable exceptions at the present being Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, Russia, and, of course, North Korea. However, at the present time, the US military has no direct bases within any country that borders China directly by land. And so, China is able to maintain some sense of strategic depth separating their mainland from their chief geopolitical rivals' armed forces. The closest American bases to the Chinese mainland right now are the some 30,000 US troops based in South Korea. Therefore, to the Chinese, North Korea effectively functions as a kind of buffer state between themselves and the US military in East Asia. And that makes Pyongyang's survival crucially important to Beijing. Regardless of their often frustration with the Kim dynasty's pursuit of nuclear weapons and openly aggressive posture. But that's also not the only reason why China would like to maintain the status quo within Korea. Were North Korea to ever collapse for whatever reason, 3 potentially devastating outcomes could negatively impact the Chinese. The first would likely be an unprecedented refugee crisis. If the North Korean state collapses, millions of North Korean refugees escaping from the violence and the chaos aren't going to run south towards the most heavily militarized border in the world that's full of millions of landmines. They're going to run north instead across the largely open border into China. Millions of impoverished North Korean refugees flooding into northeast China en masse will be an enormously destabilizing event for Beijing, and in their footsteps, the South Korean and/or American militaries may be taking advantage of the situation and advancing into North Korea in order to restore order and unify the peninsula under the democratic regime of Seoul. Were that to happen without the Chinese intervening, the American military would be capable for the very first time of positioning bases and troops directly across one of China's own borders on land. And the ideologically opposed democratic regime in Korea would exist immediately across the border from China's own authoritarian regime. That's the second problem. While the third is North Korea's own threats and blackmail against Beijing to keep their support coming. North Korea possesses dozens of nuclear weapons and the world's 3rd largest stockpile of chemical and biological weapons after the United States and Russia. In the event of a complete state collapse scenario, any number of these weapons of mass destruction could become lost or get acquired by some unpredictable faction or terrorist group during the chaos. And those groups may or may not end up deploying them around China's neighborhood or even against China itself. China would have to deal with all 3 of these terrible scenarios were the North Korean state to suddenly collapse. And the Kim regime is well aware of this leverage over Beijing. China really has no other choice then but to continue supporting North Korea financially and militarily, at least to a point where the state won't be guaranteed to collapse and cause all of these problems. Regardless of China's common frustrations with North Korea is basically capable of just blackmailing China into continuing supporting them. And that is why it's almost impossible to get China to actually cooperate on financial sanctions against North Korea that Beijing views as too destabilizing, why almost all of North Korea's trade is conducted with China, and why China prefers the status quo as it is within the Korean peninsula, with as little changes made as possible. This is also why anyone attempting an assassination attempt against Kimjongun isn't a good option either. Even if it were successful, the assassination would probably only result in one of 2 outcomes. 1. Kim Jong-un is removed from power, but the country rallies around one of his other family members who survives and maintains the dynasty's grip on power. potentially his sister and apparent successor at the moment, Kim Yo-jong. Assassinating the country's head of state like this would almost certainly be interpreted as an act of war. And then we're right back to the millions of casualties dilemma from the military intervention option. The second potential outcome is that the Kim family falls apart over the assassination and no clear successor emerges, plunging North Korea into either a civil war or collapse scenario and leading us back to China's security dilemma, in which Beijing would be likely to intervene in one way or another so as to maintain the status quo as much as possible, potentially by simply installing a puppet government that remains friendly to Beijing. Then there's negotiation, but negotiating with North Korea to get rid of their nuclear weapons isn't very likely to work out either, considering Pyongyang's own perspective and recent history. Although the full-scale fighting during the Korean War may have ended 70 years ago in 1953 with a ceasefire, the North has still to this day never signed a formal peace treaty ending the state of war between itself and the South and the United States. They face off against tens of thousands of US troops immediately across from their border, along with more than 500,000 active-duty South Korean troops, with a formal state of war continuing. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, North Korea lost their primary security partner, and they quickly realized that with their enormous conventional inferiority relative to the United States, their best and really only hope at survival was to probably acquire nuclear weapons in order to deter any incoming attack. By 1994, they were already harvesting weapons-grade plutonium from their primary nuclear facility here at Yongbyon, and the United States under the Clinton administration began preparing for war. A plan was drafted up in the White House to send stealth fighters and cruise missiles to attack and destroy the nuclear facilities around Yongbyon before a bomb could be successfully developed there. But it was all called off in nearly the last moment because the fear it would trigger full-scale war and the artillery destruction of Seoul was simply considered to be too great. The Clinton administration settled on diplomacy instead in the 1994 Agreed Framework, in which the North agreed to freeze their nuclear weapons program in exchange for alternative fuel supplies from the United States and the eventual normalization of relations. That deal, though, would not survive very long. By 2002, a new president was in the White House who, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, would label North Korea, along with Iran and Iraq, as being a part of his so-called axis of evil.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction. These regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
Then across 2002, it became obvious that the Bush administration was preparing for a full-scale invasion of one of those members, Iraq. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had previously abandoned their nuclear weapons program and was now powerless to stop the conventional invasion. And seeing the writing on the wall, North Korea opted to formally withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in January of 2003, becoming the only country to have ever signed it and then withdrew later. The United States invaded Iraq only a couple of months later, and North Korea would successfully detonate their first nuclear weapon just 3 years after that in 2006. And ever since Iraq in 2003, there have also been 2 other countries who either once pursued or possessed nuclear weapons and gave them up voluntarily, only to then be subsequently attacked or invaded by hostile foreign powers without any fear of a nuclear retaliation. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, which got attacked by NATO in 2011 after agreeing to end their nuclear weapons program in 2003, and Ukraine, which got attacked by Russia in 2014 and again in 2022, after surrendering around 1,700 nuclear warheads back in 1994, in exchange for security guarantees that were obviously broken. These 3 examples have sent a very clear message to the Kim regime and every other country around the world that surrendering their nuclear weapons exposes their vulnerability to hostile outside powers. And the example of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now sends an even further message. The conventionally superior United States and NATO have all refused to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine or to directly engage with the Russian military out of fear of Russia's nuclear weapons arsenal, in stark contrast to quick American American interventions against opponents who did not possess nuclear deterrents in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and many more. The Kim regime knows that their nuclear weapons are their shield against any interventions coming from the West. And convincing them otherwise through diplomacy, economic sanctions, or military intervention is almost certain to be a fool's errand, especially while the United States maintains an aggressive posture in South Korea. So then what option, if any, does that even leave for dealing with North Korea? The simple truth is that by this point, there aren't really any good options remaining. And that's why no US nor South Korean president has ever been able to find a long-term solution to this problem now for more than 70 years. But the problem is only bound to grow even worse over the next few decades, because South Korea is almost certain to grow weaker relative to North Korea with time. You see, South Korea's population is currently undergoing a crisis. At the present time, South Korea has the #1 lowest fertility rate of any country in the world, with South Korean women only having an average of 1.1 children each. This has been a trend that has been building for decades, and as a consequence, South Korea's population has essentially already peaked. Right now, the South Korean population is roughly double North Korea's population, but over the next several years, South Korea's population will decline, while North Korea's will remain more or less the same, because North Korea's demographics are comparatively much healthier. North Korean women are still on average having roughly double the amount of children that South Korean women are having, at about 1.9 births per woman, which is leading to an interesting inevitability. This is the population pyramid of South Korea on the right, and this is the population pyramid of North Korea over on the left. The most fascinating thing to draw from this data is that despite the South's overall population being roughly double the North's right now in 2023, the amount of children aged 14 and younger in both countries is roughly equivalent, with around 6 million in North Korea and 6.2 million in South Korea. If these trends continue, it means that within just 20 to 30 years from now, the numbers of military-age men in both countries will have effectively equalized, and the South's advantage in manpower that it enjoys today will have been lost. Doubly so when considering that the North utilizes much harsher conscription laws that forces all of their men into the armed forces for at least 10-year terms, compared to only 18 months that the South currently employs for all of their men. Meaning that if the laws remain unchanged and the manpower pool equalizes, the North will have many times more men serving in active duty, combat-ready positions than the South will have. And thirdly so if, for whatever reason, over the next 20 to 30 years, the United States decides to withdraw from its current security guarantees with South Korea. Then even worse, South Korea's rapidly aging and shrinking population over the next several decades portends a decreased ability to keep their hyper-competitive economic machine running that funds their military. 30 years from now, the South Korean population is presently projected to shrink from 52 million down to only 44 million. While the percentage of those 44 million people remaining over the age of 64 who are usually retired and no longer contributing to the economy will be around 40%, leaving only around 26 million South Koreans younger than 64, supporting 18 million seniors in retirement, compared with 43 million South Koreans younger than 64 today, supporting only 9 million seniors in retirement. That is some dangerous economic math for South Korea, and unless they resort to immigration to replace the workers they're losing, or adapt with some kind of worker automation, their export-driven economy is at a degree of risk for faltering, whereas North Korea will most likely remain more or less the same as it is today. That really just means that North Korea's best strategy to continue fighting the Korean War is basically to simply do nothing and wait out the next 20 to 30 years while its manpower advantages steadily increase over the South's, while keeping all of its more powerful enemies at bay with continuous nuclear threats, and just hope that the United States for some reason withdraws from the South over that same time period. A scenario that becomes increasingly plausible if the South's economic usefulness to Washington begins to steadily erode. If the stars end up aligning just like this, the South is going to be in trouble, and they know it. Unlike North Korea's leverage over China with their extensive blackmail, South Korea wields very little leverage at all over the United States. And consequently, fearful of the rising threat of North Korea's missiles and bellicose rhetoric, China's growing expansionism, and the possibility that the United States may not take its security guarantees as seriously in the future as previously believed, the United States might have to be prepared for North Korea no longer being the only nuclear-armed state on the Korean Peninsula. You see, a poll conducted back in February of 2022 found that an almost overwhelming 71% of South Koreans were in favor of their country acquiring their own nuclear weapons, while another poll a few months later found that nearly 64% of South Koreans supported it, even if it placed their country in open violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a fact that would likely transform Seoul into an international pariah across a lot of the world. If South Korea's manpower and economic advantages truly begin to deteriorate relative to the North over the coming 30 years as their demographics suggest, and the North remains in possession of nuclear weapons, and if the United States begins to shrink away from its security guarantees, it all implies that the best way for the South to continue deterring the North from an invasion would simply be for them to acquire nuclear weapons and missiles as well. And from there, it's almost anybody's guess as to where the Korean conflict will end up going, and how the conflict will eventually come to an end. It has been locked in a stalemate for the past 70 years, and is likely to continue remaining locked in a stalemate for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean that outbreaks of violence between the two sides never happens. Ever since the turn of the 21st century, there have been dozens of reported incidents, skirmishes, and defection attempts between the two Koreas that have sometimes gotten frighteningly close to restarting the all-out war. The most frightening incident of all took place across 2010, when North and South Korean artillery fired shells at each other's positions, resulting in several casualties, while a North Korean torpedo sank a South Korean Navy vessel that claimed the lives of 46 South Korean sailors. The modern continuation of the Cold War in Korea is, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating, violent, and controversial conflicts of both the 20th and 21st centuries. And that means that it's simultaneously not acceptable for me to cover in any kind of detail here on YouTube due to their terms of service. I know how making videos on YouTube works, and I know that this video already has a super high chance of being demonetized and unpromoted by YouTube's algorithm because of the controversial content that I'm discussing. But the moment I really start diving into the whole history of the Korean conflict in the 21st century, what's at stake, why it all began, how it's been fought, and how it all led to where we are today, it's a guarantee that this video will be demonetized and age restricted. And that means YouTube would never promote the video to you. And that's why instead, I wanted to include a full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that's about the same length as this video with all of that controversial but fascinating information included, and uploaded it directly to Nebula, which, as you've probably heard by now, is home to tons of exclusive ad-free content like my entire Modern Conflict series, which in addition to my video covering the 21st century Korean conflict, also includes 20 other full-length episodes containing more than 7 hours worth of combined content that you can go and watch right now, covering recent major wars and conflicts that'll help you stay up to date on what's going on around our world and why. From these videos covering Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, to this one covering the civil war in Yemen, to this one covering the Xinjiang and Uyghur conflict within China. Of course, the reason why all of these videos are only available on Nebula is because they just wouldn't ever work here on YouTube, and would never be able to be viewed here because of the way this site works in relation to highly controversial and sensitive recent events. On the other hand, Nebula is a totally different platform without an algorithm and without any ads. It's just a platform about great and unique content made by great and independent educational creators, with plenty of other unique, exclusive bonus projects from other creators you probably already know, like Real Engineering's incredible World War II era Battle of Britain and Logistics a D-Day series, or Neo's Underexposure series, covering events like the Bin Laden raid or the investigation into the shoot-down of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine. The best way to get access to Nebula and all of this incredible exclusive content is through today's sponsor CuriosityStream and their amazing bundle deal with Nebula. And with its current sales price, it's less than $15 a year to get full access to both of them. And CuriosityStream has some pretty awesome and relevant stuff that you're definitely going to enjoy as well, like Machinery of War, a fantastic 3-part series with 50-minute episodes that dives deep into how machines are used for logistics, agility, and mass destruction purposes in modern 21st century combat. I really can't recommend this documentary enough, and I genuinely don't know about a better deal that exists anywhere in streaming. You get 2 streaming sites, both with content you'll actually watch, and all for less than $15 a year at the current sales price. But what's even more, signing up will actually help countless independent educational creators beyond just real-life lore. So please make sure to do so by clicking this button that's here on your screen right now, which will take you to curiositystream.com/reallifelore, or by following the link that's down below in the description. And as always, thank you so much for watching.